Vladimir Putin's greatest risk, though, is not going to be a Ukrainian drone. It's precisely that which he worries about, betrayal from the inside. And how realistic is it? Well, Russian history shows us that a leader, when he's weak, when he's shown himself to not be able to defend himself any longer, it's quite bloodletting, and they are willing to get rid of leaders like Putin in a heartbeat if that means they are able to preserve their own clan and its interest. Ukraine at this point is taking back territory from the Russians. In fact, it's sort of incredible when we see what the numbers are showing. At this point, the Ukrainians have been able to liberate about 26 settlements so far, but it looks like more are about to be liberated as well. But in addition to that, we see that the Russians are struggling to hold on to the front lines. In fact, across the 627 square kilometers where they were fighting, where they recently advanced or infiltrated, well, net territorial control, it expanded only by 81 square kilometers. That means only 13% of Russian frontline movement translate into actual territorial expansion. That's not a lot. And keep in mind what the cost of that is. About a year ago, the Russians were losing, casualtied, about 60 to 70 soldiers per square kilometer. Today, that number has shot up to 1,320 casualties per square kilometer. Russia today is burning through soldiers at a rate that simply is unsustainable. It costs far too much of both their soldiers and of the Russian economy. To keep losing at this rate is something that Russia cannot afford. When people believe that Russia today is winning because it had some microscopic gains on the map, they don't understand what the purpose of war is. War isn't simply about attacking your enemy. It's about achieving political objectives. In this case, Vladimir Putin's objectives were clear. He wished to take Kyiv, to install a puppet dictatorship, to also make sure that Ukraine was demilitarized. But in his long laundry list of different things that he planned on forcing upon the Ukrainians, he's not achieved any of them. And even on trying to take territory in eastern Ukraine, he's failing there. At this point, if you look at the objectives that he had, Ukraine has successfully denied him the ability of achieving his goals. And as such, Russia, by the definition of what it is to win a war, is not winning, it is losing. Vladimir Putin himself lives in complete terror. For at least the last 10 months, he's been locked away most of the time in a bunker. But now, even when he travels, he lives in complete isolation and fear. Even when he was recently in Novosibirsk, that's over 3,000 kilometers from Ukraine, he was forced to flee. He didn't stick around for his whole trip because he was scared of the Ukrainian drones. Look at his residency down on the Black Sea. He hasn't been there in over a year because of fear of Ukrainian drones. And sure enough, Ukrainian drones, they've come pretty close to that facility. But overall, Putin is a man who has to worry about something else. He has to worry about those around him, those in the Kremlin itself. That is by far his greatest risk, and it's something that he seems to be aware of. Today, Vladimir Putin's greatest risk, though, is not going to be a Ukrainian drone. It's precisely that which he worries about, betrayal from the inside. And how realistic is it? Well, Russian history shows us that a leader, when he's weak, when he's shown himself to not be able to defend himself any longer, it's quite bloodletting, and they are willing to get rid of leaders like Putin in a heartbeat if that means they are able to preserve their own clan and its interest. The situation within Russia itself is truly going off the ramps. Look what we see right now with the Ukrainian attacks across the wild berries of Russia. That's something like the Amazon of Russia. But there's something important. Ukraine, yes, has destroyed 7 out of the 10 largest storage facilities for wild berries. But there's something that a lot of people are missing. Wild berries? Well, there's billions of dollars, between $6 to $9 billion, it's estimated, of goods that were destroyed during those attacks. That's going to wipe out a lot of businesses. Those businesses, they owe money to the banks. But you know who owes even more money to the banks? Wild berries itself. It was already operating in the red before these attacks began. But after these attacks, they might lose up to $10 billion. That's going to wipe them out. And if they go bankrupt, well, they owe a lot of money to a bank that's called VTB. It's the second largest one in Russia. It's between 19 and 21% of market share. But if they don't get repaid, if Wild Berries just says, we're going to default, we can't pay back our loans, VTB Bank itself would then have a significant liquidity crisis. At that point, it's questionable whether or not VTB would be able to continue operating. But if it were to collapse, that's a fifth of the Russian banking sector going down all at one time. That could very well have a cascading effect across the Russian banking sector. It's something that could destroy the Russian economy. The Russian government, it doesn't have sufficient liquidity to step in to assist as you would expect in a foreign country. The other major banks, like Sberbank, they also lack the necessary liquidity. In fact, right now, the liquidity crisis that we see across Russia, the one that's affecting the Kremlin as well as the private sector banks, well, it's showing us today that Russia is far weaker than many people might believe. We know the banking sector in Russia is having significant problems, and that's something they openly talk about at this point. But there's something else that's probably a sign that it's far worse than many people might believe. We saw recently that the government decided that those who work in the banks and in central banks will be allowed to keep arms, to keep firearms. Now, in theory, that's to shoot down drones. But isn't it strange? So far, there's been no banks that have been targeted by the Ukrainians. Why not arm the people at Wildberries? Well, the reason is simple. It's really not about shooting down drones. This is all a guise. It's about something much more simple. They're making sure that those who work in the banks have sufficient firepower to put down mobs should they show up and try to withdraw their money. If that seems extreme, look what we've seen in recent months. In the month of June, there was a 40% increase in the amount of cash withdrawals. What's shocking about that? The month before, well, that was the record month, but it was 40% more than the record month. At this point, Russians are taking out billions of dollars a month. That is far more than what the Russian economy can absorb. But also look at this. As right now, Russia is doing things to stop the attack of drones, they're turning off the internet. They're preventing people from using electronic means of wire transfers or using their cell phones, using bank cards. That is all translating to one simple thing, that people are forced to use cash. So now you're combining a general fear in the society with the actual need to have cash. In both cases, you're leaving the banks in a worse situation with less cash than they've ever had before. But for the Russian government, there's something else they should really be concerned by. Look what we've seen just last month, where over $1 billion in government war bonds was given back. Those investors decided they need the liquidity in the short term. They weren't willing to hold on to it. That's the largest amount that we've seen sold in about 30 years, since 1998 when the Russian economy collapsed last time. Now, that might not seem shocking by itself, but consider also this. Russia, in the third quarter of this year, which we're in right now, they're supposed to fundraise about $16 billion, according to their official budget, through the selling of war bonds. But so far, out of the 4 attempts that they've made, 2 of them, they had to close down the auction because there were no buyers. One of them, the investors wanted too much interest. The government said no. And in the last one, they only raised 9% of their target amount. That means that the Russian government today is having a significant liquidity crisis. The most impressive part, though, is that Kremlin think tanks back in December 2025 were already predicting that this would come by fall 2026. What we're seeing right now was predicted by Kremlin planners, that their economy is about to collapse. Now, Vladimir Putin himself is under an incredible amount of pressure. Remember, his constituency ultimately is not the people of Russia. He doesn't really care what happens to them. He doesn't care about their future. They don't elect him. But he has to keep the elites happy, those who are in charge of the security structure. But those exact people are the ones he should be the most afraid of, because they can take action to replace him if they decide he is no longer worth keeping around. But more than that, there's a good chance that these sorts of elites, those from the security apparatus, could take power in the Kremlin should Putin fall. Putin one day will eventually die. And when he dies, who will come after him is something that's quite an open question. But there are more and more signs that those at the very top, those in charge of the intelligence services, understand they have to move now to consolidate power to make sure that nobody else is able to get in and that they remain in charge of Russia. There should not be a question whether or not there will be a civil war within the Kremlin. We're watching it unfold already. Look what we've seen in the Russian military. Over the past few years, about 17 generals have been arrested. That's more than all the NATO countries combined. But who's the one going after them? Who's pursuing them? Well, it's those people coming from the Federal Security Service, the FSB, the successor of the KGB. Right now, they're doing their best to crack down on those who would have the best streams of revenue, those who work in things like acquisitions. But also, they arrested one general who's really worth paying attention to. He was a general in charge of choosing who would get promoted and to which offices they'd be promoted, who would get more rank. Now, this guy, why he matters so much? You can be sure he is probably the general who received more bribes from the other officers in Russia than anyone else. Everybody would have had to make deals for him in order to continue their careers. So why is his arrest so important? Well, just imagine, with his level of corruption, dealing in tens of millions of dollars, he undoubtedly would have had a black book indicating who paid him for what. That would have been something that would have compromised all the rest of the officer corps. Now, if you're the FSB, that's exactly the sort of compromising material that you seek for, the kompromat, as they call it in Russian. That's a famous way that they work. They always look for a way to set up a means to profit from you, to make money off of your misery. And that's what we're trying to do right now with the Russian military. A lot of people might be surprised that there are some in Russia who are happy to see the Russian military being destroyed inside of Ukraine. They don't view it to be a loss, because ultimately it's getting rid of their future competition. The destruction of the Russian military destructs the things like their tanks. It's not a loss if you're somebody in the National Guard back in Moscow. They only have 36 tanks. Those tanks are specifically there to put down military uprisings. So if the Russian regular military simply doesn't have enough tanks anymore, would you view it as a negative or positive if it gives you the upper hand in the civil war that is currently starting? Right now inside of Russia, we are watching as there are simultaneously several different powder kegs that are ready to explode over the question of who is going to take the leadership of Russia and of Chechnya. In the case of Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov, the strongman, the warlord who's been running the region for over already decades, well, he looks quite sick. He's not going to be around forever. But Vladimir Putin is vetoing his sons being able to take over the region. And that is leading the region into a very dangerous position. One that could easily explode at any time. But the other one, inside of Moscow itself. Who will come after Vladimir Putin? That's a big question. And that's why there's so much tension. Putin has never acknowledged who would be his successor. And that leaves the game fully open. And everybody is trying to get in on it. Whether it's those coming from different factions of the FSB. They're not a unified monolith. Or is it going to be those coming from things such as the groups in the National Guard? Or are it going to be those who are coming from the other parts of the elites who hope to buy their position into this? But where it will come from is not yet clear. However, at this point, we can be absolutely certain that everybody's eyes are already looking at who will take the throne after Putin. Whoever comes after Vladimir Putin is unlikely to be some sort of extremist nationalist. It's unlikely to be somebody who's even going to continue the war in Ukraine. And the reason is very simple. Whoever comes to power after Putin is going to be dealing with a country that's fractured, with an elite that's ready to wage a civil war against the other parts of the elite to consolidate power, to make sure that they're able to take as many assets as possible. But if that's what's occurring, if everybody's trying to loot the country, everybody's trying to cut you out from power, well, then you need those soldiers not in Donbass, but you need them in Moscow. You need them there to be able to protect your regime. And that's why whoever comes to power after Putin is most likely going to be willing to trade the war in Ukraine to keep his own power. But more than that, to gain international recognition from other countries, like Western countries. Well, it's going to be important that you can show them that you're willing to work with them. Closing down Donbass, giving it away in order to consolidate your power back in Moscow is a strategically wise move if you wish to be the next dictator in Russia. No matter where you look inside of Russia right now, the situation is dire. When we look at the front with Ukraine, they're losing territory. When you look at what's happening right now with the Russian economy, it's about to go into full implosion. But then look what's happening inside of Moscow. Already there's a fight for power in the country. Already all the conditions are set for a much bigger war. And that war has already started. Who will take power next in Russia is still a question. But we should have no doubt whatsoever that this fight is the one that everybody should be keeping their eyes on.